The fluorescent lights of the supermarket cast a sickly, sterile glow over the long, winding checkout line, an endless serpent of trolleys and harried shoppers that seemed to stretch into the very maw of Friday evening. Each plastic wheel squeaked a monotonous, weary tune against the polished linoleum, a soundtrack to the collective sigh of a week's end. It was the absolute worst time to be anywhere, let alone standing still with a grocery cart overflowing with the mundane necessities of life, and a toddler teetering precariously on the edge of an epic meltdown. The air, thick with the scent of freshly baked bread, industrial cleaning products, and the faint, underlying aroma of human exhaustion, pressed down like a physical weight, making every minute feel like an hour. The low thrum of the refrigerated displays, and the incessant beeping of scanners, the muffled announcements over the PA system, all converged into a dull roar that seemed to vibrate directly inside David's skull. He gripped the handle of his cart, his knuckles white, a silent anchor in a sea of encroaching chaos. His eyes, usually a calm, deep hazel, now held a glint of desperation, flicking from the digital clock above the cashier's head to the small, increasingly agitated figure strapped into the child seat of his trolley. Lily, his 4-year-old daughter, was doing her best to maintain her composure, but the battle was clearly being lost. Her lower lip began to quiver, a telltale sign that the floodgates were about to burst, threatening to unleash a torrent of tired tears and indignant wails that would echo through the cavernous space. Further down the line, a different kind of tension was brewing, a distinctly human kind. A man, broad-shouldered and radiating an unearned sense of entitlement, stood impatiently, his eyes darting around with an almost predatory impatience. He wore an expensive-looking tracksuit, his movements jerky and aggressive as he shifted his weight from foot to foot. His gaze, laced with thinly veiled contempt, swept over the other shoppers, pausing with particular disdain on parents struggling with their children. This man, with his puffed-up chest and a sneer perpetually etched onto his features, was a walking testament to the idea that some people simply had no tolerance for the messy, unpredictable realities of everyday life, especially when those realities dared to inconvenience them. Then he seemed to embody the very essence of a storm cloud gathering on an already overcast day, his presence a dark, low hum beneath the supermarket's artificial bright lights. David tried to tune out the general din, focusing all his energy on his daughter. Lily needed him, now more than ever. He reached back, his large hand gently stroking her fine, light brown hair, which clung damply to her forehead. "Almost there, sweet pea," he murmured, his voice a low, reassuring rumble, even as he felt the subtle tremor in his own hand. "Just a little longer. Then we get to go home and have those dinosaur nuggets you love." He offered her a small, crinkly bag of organic apple slices, hoping the distraction, however fleeting, might stave off the inevitable. Lily eyed the snack with suspicion, her large, innocent eyes, so like her mother's, already welling up. A single tear escaped, tracing a path down her flushed cheek, and David's heart clenched with a familiar ache. The raw, unprotected vulnerability of fatherhood, especially single fatherhood, was a constant, searing presence. He remembered a time when standing in line felt like an inconvenience, a minor delay in a perfectly ordered existence. Now, it felt like an endurance test, a public performance where every misstep, every moment of weakness felt magnified under the scrutiny of unseen eyes. Every sniffle, every whine from Lily felt like a personal failure, a testament to his perceived inability to keep her perfectly content, perfectly quiet, perfectly manageable. The pressure was immense, a silent, invisible weight that bore down on his broad shoulders. It was a burden he carried with a quiet, almost stoic grace, like a testament to something deeper, more resilient, that simmered beneath his calm exterior. There was an unspoken strength in his bearing, a coiled tension that few would recognize, let alone understand. It was a strength born of unimaginable experiences, a quiet power that had been forged in the crucible of extreme circumstances. far removed from the mundane anxieties of a supermarket queue. The line inched forward, agonizingly slow. Lily's whines escalated, morphing into small, pathetic sobs. "Daddy, I'm tired," she whimpered, her tiny hands reaching out for him, her desire to be held, to be comforted, radiating from her small frame. David longed to scoop her up, to hold her close, but the practicalities of a full trolley and a packed line prevented it. He knelt slightly, leaning into the child's seat, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I know, baby, I know you're tired, but we're so close. Just a few more minutes." He blew a silly raspberry on her cheek, trying to elicit a giggle, but she only burrowed her face into his shoulder, her tears dampening his worn t-shirt. The other shoppers, mostly preoccupied with their own end-of-week exhaustion, offered varying degrees of sympathy. Some averted their gaze entirely, some offered a small, understanding smile. But then there was him. The man in the tracksuit, 2 trolleys behind David, made a loud, exasperated sigh. It wasn't just a sigh, it was a performance, designed to draw attention, to convey maximum irritation. He shifted again, his eyes narrowing, fixing on David and Lily with an overt stare of annoyance. "Can't you keep your kid quiet?" he barked, his voice carrying clearly above the supermarket's drone, cutting through the thin veil of polite indifference. "Some of us have had a long day and don't need to listen to that racket." David felt a familiar tremor run through him, a flash of something cold and sharp. It was an instinct, a flicker of an old, deeply ingrained response to confrontation, to the sudden intrusion of aggression. But he pushed it down, deep inside, where it lay dormant, a beast caged by responsibility and love. He didn't turn around immediately. Instead, he maintained eye contact with Lily, offering her another reassuring smile, as if the bully's words were nothing more than a passing breeze. "It's okay, sweet pea," he said, his voice remaining level, steady, a bulwark against the rising tide of hostility. "Don't mind him, we're almost there." The bully, emboldened by David's apparent non-response, took another step closer, his voice growing louder, more sneering. "Oh, don't mind him, eh? Typical. Just ignore your responsibilities, right? Can't even control your own offspring." His words were laced with a venomous condescension, designed to wound, to provoke. David could feel the eyes of other shoppers on him now, the silent witnesses to this unfolding drama. He felt a wave of heat rise in his chest, a primal urge to react, to shut the man down with a swift, decisive move. But then he felt Lily's small hand clutch his shirt, her sobs subsiding slightly as she sensed the change in atmosphere, the sudden tension. His little girl was watching him, dependent on him, relying on him to protect her, to be her calm in the storm. That was his new mission, his sole purpose, a far cry from the missions he once undertook in distant, so dangerous lands. He took a slow, measured breath, the kind that used to steady his aim in far more perilous situations. He turned slowly, deliberately, towards the man in the tracksuit, his expression carefully neutral. There was no anger visibly etched on his face, no immediate sign of offense. Instead, there was a quiet, almost unsettling stillness about him, a stillness that belied the internal storm. His eyes, though calm, held a depth that seemed to absorb the bully's aggression without reflecting it, a calm pool beneath a turbulent surface. "Sir," David said, his voice remarkably even, a low baritone that commanded attention without raising its volume. "My daughter's tired. We're doing our best. There's no need for that kind of language." The bully, clearly expecting an angry outburst, a defensive retort, or perhaps even a cowering apology, seemed taken aback by David's composed response. His brow furrowed, a flicker of confusion crossing his face, before it quickly morphed back into a sneer, amplified now by a sense of irritation at being defied so calmly. "Oh, doing your best, are we? Doesn't look like much best to me, pal. Looks like you can't handle a simple trip to the grocery store. Maybe you should stay home if you can't control your brat." He emphasized the word brat with particular relish, his gaze flicking to Lily, who flinched slightly at the harsh tone. That word, brat, used in front of his daughter, was a chisel striking a deep fissure in David's carefully constructed calm. He felt the familiar cold surge of adrenaline, a relic of a life he had left behind, threatening to break through his disciplined exterior. For a fleeting second, his posture subtly shifted, his weight distributing differently, his hands unconsciously flexing. An almost imperceptible change, a micro-expression in his eyes that only a trained observer might catch, a glint of something dangerous, something primal. It was the whisper of a coiled spring, held taut by sheer force of will. But then he remembered Lily, her small, vulnerable face now pressed against his side, seeking refuge. He inhaled deeply, the scent of her shampoo a grounding force. "Look, buddy," the bully continued, puffing out his chest, misinterpreting David's stillness as weakness, as fear. "I'm just saying, some of us have lives, busy schedules. We don't have time for this circus. Maybe if you were a bit more present, a bit more capable, she wouldn't be causing such a scene. Is there even a mother around to teach you how to properly deal with a kid? Or are you just winging it, making a mess for everyone else?" His voice was dripping with contempt, striking at the most tender, most vulnerable part of David's life, his status as a single father, a wound that never truly healed. The silence in the line deepened, the other shoppers now fully engrossed, some whispering amongst themselves, some looking away uncomfortably. They knew this had gone too far. David's gaze hardened, the calm in his eyes taking on a metallic sheen. The insult wasn't just about his parenting. It was a direct, vicious attack on his very existence as a father, a cruel jab at the absence of Lily's mother, a void he fought every single day to fill with love and strength. A dark, quiet fury began to stir within him, a deep-seated anger that had been carefully suppressed for years, an anger that, in another life, in another context, would have unleashed swift, overwhelming consequences. He felt the familiar, almost unbearable pressure behind his eyes, the urge to lash out, to silence the man with the efficiency he had once applied to far more serious threats. But he was a father now, not a soldier. He was David, not the legend. He looked at Lily, who, sensing the shift, looked up at him with wide, questioning eyes. He forced a small, reassuring smile, an incredible act of will in that moment. Then, his gaze, now cold and unwavering, met the bully's. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a grand gesture. He simply stood there, his large frame radiating an inexplicable, almost palpable intensity that belied his calm demeanor. Even the air around them seemed to thicken, charged with an unspoken challenge. The bully, for all his bluster, felt a prickle of unease. There was something in David's eyes, a quiet, ancient warning, that he couldn't quite place, but it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The challenge was out there, hanging in the suffocating silence of the supermarket. An invisible line had been crossed, and David's reaction, or lack thereof, was the most profound response of all. His quiet composure, his controlled strength, was a promise of something far more significant, far more dangerous than any shouted retort. The bully had made a grave miscalculation. David simply stared at the man, his eyes conveying a message that transcended words, a deep, silent resolve that held something back, something powerful and terrible, something that remained hidden beneath the surface of the devoted single father. The other shoppers held their breath, waiting for the explosion, for the dramatic confrontation. But it didn't come, not in the way they expected. David merely held the man's gaze, his expression unreadable, a silent testament to a strength forged in fires the bully could never comprehend. The line moved again just slightly, pulling David forward by a few feet. He didn't break eye contact with the bully for a moment, a silent promise hanging in the air. The bully, still trying to project an image of dominance, finally, reluctantly, broke eye contact, his face now a faint shade of red, a flicker of something resembling apprehension in his eyes. He had pushed too far, and though David hadn't reacted violently, the sheer intensity of his non-reaction was more unsettling than any punch. The confrontation was far from over. It had merely shifted, deepened, taken on a more ominous tone. The foundations for something explosive had been laid, and the quiet father holding his crying child had revealed only a fraction of the immense power he contained. What could possibly drive such a man to such an extraordinary level of restraint, even in the face of such direct personal insult? What hidden depths lay beneath that calm exterior, that stoic, fatherly devotion? The answer, waiting to unfold, would shatter the bully's comfortable ignorance and reveal a past that few could ever imagine. The supermarket, that mundane arena of everyday life, was about to become the stage for a dramatic reveal, a clash between everyday malice and extraordinary, suppressed power. Stay tuned for part two to see how David handles this escalating situation and the true extent of the bully's miscalculation. The caustic laughter, heavy with contempt and a distinct lack of self awareness, hung in the sterile air of the grocery store, momentarily silencing the gentle hum of refrigerators and the distant clatter of shopping carts. It was a sound designed to dominate, to assert, to diminish. For a fleeting instant, every eye in the immediate vicinity, from the bored cashier to the elderly woman meticulously counting change in the next line, flickered towards the source, then swiftly away, drawn by an instinct to avoid entanglement. But the insult, sharp and pointed, had found its mark, not just in the ears of the single father, but in the fragile sanctity of his quiet morning. And this was not a skirmish in some distant, forgotten land, nor was it a high-stakes negotiation in a corporate boardroom. This was aisle 7, between organic kale and gluten-free pasta, a fluorescent-lit tableau of everyday mundanity that had been abruptly, violently, fractured by a public denigration. The man, a looming figure of casual cruelty, now stood with a smirk etched across his face, clearly expecting a reaction, preferably one of shame or capitulation. He reveled in the discomfort he had sown, feeding on the silence that followed his verbal assault like a predator on carrion. The setting, a simple neighborhood supermarket, usually pulsed with the quiet rhythm of domesticity. The soft murmur of shopping lists, the rustle of plastic bags, the universal choreography of choosing and purchasing. But now, it was a crucible, some unexpectedly heated. The fluorescent lights, usually so unforgiving in their clinical glare, seemed to intensify the scrutiny on the single father, casting sharp shadows under his tired eyes, highlighting the slight tremor in the hand that instinctively reached for his youngest daughter's shoulder. His 2 children, a girl no older than 6 and a boy perhaps 8, stood beside him, clutching comfortingly familiar grocery items, a box of sugary cereal, a brightly colored juice box, their innocent faces clouded with confusion and a nascent fear. The father, a man whose posture usually carried an understated strength, seemed to shrink, if only imperceptibly, under the bully's gaze, or so the bully surely perceived it. Yet, beneath the surface of his apparent retreat lay a stillness that was not weakness, but a profound, almost terrifying, control. It was the stillness of a deep ocean, calm on the surface, but holding immeasurable power beneath. The problem, or rather, the conflict, was not merely the initial insult. It was the bully's relentless pursuit, the clear intention to amplify the discomfort, to dismantle the father's composure piece by agonizing peace. He saw the father's quiet demeanor, the lack of an immediate, aggressive retort, as an invitation, a green light to press harder. "What's the matter, pal?" the bully goaded, his voice dripping with mock concern, loud enough for half the store to hear. "Can't afford a real dinner for your kids, or just can't be bothered? That's what happens when you try to juggle too much, isn't it? Bet they wish they had a mom to cook them something decent." Each word was a calculated jab, designed to prick at the most vulnerable points. A father's provision, his love, his very capability. The children instinctively drew closer to their dad, their small hands seeking refuge in his calloused fingers. The girl, Lily, burrowed her face into his side, her tiny frame trembling. Her brother, Ethan, though slightly older and attempting to project a brave front, nervously shifted his weight, his eyes darting between the towering bully and his father's unnervingly placid face. He had seen his dad handle tough situations before, a scraped knee, a broken toy, a bad dream, but never anything quite like this. This felt different, heavier, with an unspoken tension that resonated in the air. The open loops tightened around the question of the father's silence. What was holding him back? Why did he endure? What was the cost of this public humiliation versus the potential consequences of retaliation? His gaze, though steady, held a depth that hinted at struggles far beyond the immediate trivialities of a grocery line. Struggles that had forged a particular kind of resilience, a practiced discipline. The bully, emboldened by the father's continued silence, took a step closer, invading the already shrinking personal space around the small family. His scent, a jarring mix of stale cigarettes and cheap cologne, assaulted the senses. "Look at you," he sneered, gesturing dismissively at the father's slightly faded jeans and simple t-shirt. "Trying to play the doting dad, but you can barely keep it together, huh? What kind of example are you setting for these poor kids, letting some guy walk all over you?" He postured, puffing out his chest, his eyes scanning the surrounding shoppers as if seeking affirmation for his cruel performance. A few people looked down at their feet, some averted their gaze, and the cashier, a young woman with a name tag that read Brenda, meticulously scanned a jar of pickles, her movements deliberately slow, her face a mask of practiced neutrality. The sheer human reluctance to intervene, to disrupt the uneasy social contract, was palpable. The father, whose name was Alex, remained an enigma. His shoulders, though relaxed, seemed broad, capable of bearing immense weight. His hands, though currently gentle on his daughter's back, bore the faint scars of a past that whispered of more than just domestic chores. There was a subtle tension in the line of his jaw, a muscle twitching almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign of the maelstrom brewing beneath his composed exterior. Inside, a primal furnace roared, fueled by indignation and a fierce protective instinct. He felt the weight of Lily's small head against his hip, heard Ethan's quick, shallow breaths. Every fiber of his being screamed to unleash the training that had been etched into his very bones, to put an end to this torment with a swift, decisive motion. Yet, the images of his children, their innocent eyes reflecting his every move, held him tethered. This wasn't a battlefield, nor was it an interrogation room. This was a grocery store, and these were his children, vulnerable and impressionable. The immediate gratification of silencing the bully violently would come at a far greater cost. The erosion of their peace, the shattering of their fragile sense of security. So his control was not a sign of weakness, but a monument to a far greater strength. The strength of a father protecting his children's innocence above all else. His mind, even in the midst of this escalating harassment, was a kaleidoscope of fleeting images, fragments of a life lived on the razor's edge. The dust of distant deserts, thick and red, coating everything. The hushed urgency of whispered commands in a language not his own. The acrid smell of burnt propellant, the sharp crack of distant gunfire, the chilling silence that followed. These were not memories he dwelled on, not anymore. He had buried them deep, under layers of parenting handbooks, bedtime stories, and the rhythmic cycle of laundry and school runs. But the bully's aggression, the encroaching threat, was a crude key turning in a lock he had tried to seal shut. He tasted the metallic tang of adrenaline, a familiar companion from a different life. His peripheral vision, honed by years of threat assessment, tracked every movement, every subtle shift in the bully's weight, every flicker of intent in his eyes. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him, exactly how quickly he could incapacitate the man, exactly what pressure points to target, exactly how to end this. But he held back, a veteran commander internally debating the strategic cost of engaging. The bully, oblivious to the dormant tempest before him, saw only a meek man. He saw a target. "What, nothing to say?" he sneered, drawing another loud laugh from himself, a harsh, grating sound. "Cat got your tongue, or did you just lose your spine somewhere along the way? Probably too busy feeling sorry for yourself. Now playing the poor single dad card, huh? It's pathetic. Really, truly pathetic." He took another step forward, his chest almost touching Alex's, a deliberate act of intimidation. Alex could feel the heat radiating off the man's body, could smell the lingering scent of liquor on his breath. He met the bully's gaze not with fear, but with an unblinking intensity that, for a second, seemed to falter the bully's bravado. It was a look that had unnerved hardened adversaries, a gaze that had seen untold horrors and remained unbroken. For a flicker, a brief, almost imperceptible hesitation, the bully seemed to sense something ancient, something dangerous in Alex's eyes. But he quickly dismissed it, attributing it to his own triumph, his intimidation working its magic. "Come on, Dad, say something," the bully pressed, his voice rising in pitch, laced with a venomous sweetness. He glanced down at Lily, whose small hand was now gripping Alex's jeans so tightly her knuckles were white. "Don't you want to stand up for your kids? Or are you just going to let them see their old man get pushed around like this? Maybe they need a real man around." That last phrase, "a real man," delivered with a sneering emphasis, was the proverbial match thrown into a powder keg. It was a direct assault on Alex's identity, his competence, his very essence as a father. A ripple of something other than fear passed through Alex. His grip on Lily's shoulder tightened, a reassuring squeeze, but his eyes, previously calm and watchful, now held a glint, a spark of the inferno he kept so tightly leashed. The air around him seemed to thicken, to hum with an unspoken energy. He straightened almost imperceptibly, his shoulders squaring, his gaze hardening into something sharp and unwavering. It was a subtle shift, barely visible, but to a trained eye it spoke volumes. The stillness was no longer just controlled. It was absolute, predatory. It was the stillness of a coiled spring, wound to its absolute limit, awaiting release. The bully, too engrossed in his own performance, missed the nuance. He missed the way Alex's eyes, once tired, now held the piercing clarity of a sniper sighting his target. He failed to register the almost imperceptible tensing of every muscle in Alex's body, a subtle readiness that spoke not of aggression but of profound, immediate capability. This was not a man shrinking. This was a man preparing. The gentle father had not vanished, but beneath that exterior, the Delta Force legend. No, the quiet warrior had just been awakened. The line had been crossed. The insult directed at him he could absorb. The affront to his children, however, was a boundary no one, absolutely no one, was permitted to violate. The temperature in the immediate vicinity seemed to drop several degrees, a chilling premonition of what was to come, a silent, stark warning that only a fool would ignore. Alex's hand, still resting gently on Lily's back, was no longer just a comfort. It was a promise that this man would regret his words, and profoundly so. The bully's laughter died in his throat, replaced by a sudden, inexplicable knot of unease, as Alex's eyes, no longer merely observing, seemed to peer directly into his soul, not with anger, but with a cold, absolute certainty that stole the breath from his lungs. The air, so heavy with unspoken threats, crackled. The game for Alex was over. For the bully, it was only just beginning. The air in the sterile, fluorescent-lit aisle of the supermarket, already thick with the artificial sweetness of processed foods and the murmur of mundane weekend errands, suddenly crackled with a palpable, almost predatory energy. Mark, the single father, a man whose easygoing demeanor usually masked a formidable inner landscape, had offered a response that was outwardly calm yet carried an undertone that should have chilled anyone with an ounce of intuition. His gaze, level and unwavering, held a depth that spoke of battles far removed from price scanner squabbles, a quiet authority that defied the cheap theatrics of the man before him. Yet, the bully, oblivious and buoyed by his own distorted sense of entitlement, must saw only what he wanted to see. Weakness, a target ripe for further exploitation. The bully, a man named Gavin, whose bloated sense of self-importance was inversely proportional to his actual achievements, took a step closer, his eyes narrowing to slits. He saw the subtle tremor in the hand Mark had instinctively placed on his daughter Lily's shoulder, a protective gesture rather than one of fear, and misinterpreted it entirely. "Oh, look at Mr. Tough Guy," Gavin sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Getting all defensive over his little princess. What, can't handle a little truth, Dad?" He emphasized the last word with mocking derision, twisting it into an insult. "You probably told her you were a hero, didn't you? Saved a cat from a tree? More like saved yourself from a proper job." His laughter was harsh. a grating sound that scraped against the quiet hum of the refrigerators. Mark's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The slight pressure on Lily's shoulder was meant to reassure her, to anchor her in the storm, but also to ground himself. His daughter, usually a whirlwind of questions and boundless energy, was now clinging to his leg, her face buried against his thigh. Her small, vulnerable body was a stark reminder of why he was here, why he was enduring this pointless provocation. His focus narrowed, his peripheral vision scanning the reactions of the other shoppers, assessing the immediate environment as if it were a tactical theater of operations. The cashiers, usually adept at ignoring minor disturbances, now cast nervous glances, their smiles frozen. A young couple, a few carts back, exchanged worried whispers, in their shopping cart acting as a makeshift barricade between them and the escalating tension. Gavin, emboldened by the lack of direct physical response, mistook Mark's restraint for submission. He pressed on, his bravado swelling. You know, some men just aren't cut out for fatherhood, he continued, completely unaware of the precise psychological pressure point he was prodding. It takes a real man to raise a kid right, not some drifter who looks like he just crawled out of a gutter. Probably why you're alone, huh? No woman could stand you. His words were a crude weapon, crafted to inflict maximum emotional damage, striking at the very core of Mark's identity. His solitary struggle, his silent sacrifices, his deep-seated dedication to Lily. A flicker, swift and almost imperceptible, crossed Mark's eyes. And it was the briefest ghost of the man he once was, a shadow of the focused intensity that had defined him in the crucible of combat. In that fleeting instant, the grocery store aisle melted away, replaced by the suffocating dust of a forgotten desert, the acrid scent of cordite, and the bone-deep weariness of a 20-hour patrol. He saw, for a split second, the face of a comrade, long dead, whose last words had been about his own child, a child he would never see grow up. The memory was a sudden, icy shock, reminding him of the preciousness of the ordinary, the sanctity of simply being there for Lily, even in the mundane indignity of a supermarket queue. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the kind that had been drilled into him over years of high-stakes operations, a technique designed to steady the nerves and to bring the soaring adrenaline back to earth. My personal life is none of your concern, Mark stated, his voice still low, but now with an underlying current that was less a warning and more a promise. It was the calm before a storm, the still surface of a deep, dark pool. I suggest you mind your own business and allow me to finish my shopping. Gavin, however, was past the point of hearing reason. He'd committed to this performance, and he intended to play it out. Oh, it is my business when some deadbeat is holding up the line, pretending to be a decent father, he spat, completely ignoring the subtle shift in Mark's demeanor. He gestured dismissively at Lily, who was now clutching Mark's jeans so tightly her knuckles were white. Look at her. She probably doesn't even know what a real father looks like. Now, you're probably just waiting for the next handout, aren't you? Living off the system, while real men work for a living. This direct, contemptuous dismissal of his efforts as a parent, this callous assumption of his circumstances, was a spark on dry tinder. Mark's gaze hardened. The world might not know the extent of his service, the weight of the burdens he'd carried, the price he'd paid for freedom. But to have a stranger, a loud-mouthed bigot in a discount grocery store, invalidate his daily struggle, his silent battle to give Lily a normal life after losing her mother, was an affront that bypassed his tactical training and struck directly at the raw, exposed nerve of his heart. A middle-aged woman in the line behind them, her face etched with disapproval, finally spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. "Excuse me, sir. There's no need for that kind of language. He's with his child." Her intervention, though timid, drew a momentary pause from Gavin, who glared at her as if she were a fly buzzing too close to his ear. "Stay out of this, old hag," Gavin barked, dismissing her with a contemptuous wave of his hand. "This isn't your circus. Some people need to be told a few home truths." Mark's eyes, which had momentarily flickered towards the woman in silent gratitude, now returned to Gavin with renewed intensity. The protective instinct, honed over years of defending far more vital interests, surged to the forefront. He wasn't just defending himself now or Lily, he was defending the fragile peace of the ordinary people around them, people who simply wanted to buy their groceries without being subjected to a public spectacle of bullying. Without a word, the mark shifted his weight, a subtle, almost imperceptible redistribution that spoke volumes to anyone trained to notice. His feet, planted firmly on the linoleum floor, were now spaced precisely shoulder-width apart, his body subtly aligned as if preparing for a sudden, decisive movement. It was the stance of a man accustomed to maintaining balance under extreme duress, an unconscious echo of thousands of hours spent in situations where a fraction of a second could mean the difference between life and death. His hands, still resting gently on Lily's shoulder and by his side, were relaxed, yet ready. This was not a man preparing to throw a clumsy punch. This was a man whose entire physical being was a weapon, coiled and controlled. Gavin, blinded by his own arrogance, missed these nuanced signals entirely. He saw only a father, so clearly unwilling to make a scene, clinging to his child, looking somewhat worn. He interpreted Mark's quiet intensity as mere sullenness. "What, gonna cry, tough guy? Gonna call your mommy?" He jeered, his voice rising in volume, drawing more attention. A few more shoppers had stopped, their heads turning, their conversations dying down. The cashier at Mark's register, a young woman with wide, frightened eyes, had paused scanning, her hand hovering over a carton of eggs. Then Gavin did something that pushed the boundaries from verbal assault to physical provocation. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them. His right hand, palm open, reached out, not quite to touch Mark, but to make an intimidating, dismissive gesture in front of his face, a clear invasion of personal space. "You know what? I've had enough of your kind holding up society. Get out of my way." In that instant, time seemed to slow for Mark. The world narrowed to Gavin's sneering face, the outstretched hand, the raw indignity of it all. His mind processed the vector of the hand, the potential points of contact, the immediate threat assessment, all in a microsecond. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to react, to execute one of the dozens of disarming, debilitating moves his body had been trained to perform without conscious thought. He could seize the wrist, twist, break the arm, take the man down, control him. The options flooded his mind, a torrent of practiced responses. But then, he felt Lily's small hand tighten its grip on his leg, a desperate, silent plea. He looked down, meeting her wide, innocent eyes, and brimming with confusion and a nascent fear. Her world, usually safe and predictable in his presence, was being shattered by this crude intrusion, and in that moment, the warrior within him wrestled with the father. The warrior saw an aggressor, an immediate threat that needed to be neutralized. The father saw his daughter, needing protection from violence, needing him to be the calm, steady anchor, not another source of chaos. Mark didn't move. Not physically, but something shifted within him. His eyes, fixed on Gavin, now held a new, colder light. It wasn't anger, not rage in the conventional sense, but something far more chilling, a complete, utter lack of anything but controlled, precise intent. It was the look of a predator who has decided, unequivocally, that the time for play is over. The hand that had reached out to gesture dismissively faltered, stopping midair. Not because Mark physically intervened, but because the sheer, unblinking intensity of his gaze was a wall, an invisible barrier that radiated a silent, profound threat. Gavin, for the first time, felt a flicker of something other than his usual arrogant certainty. A prickle of unease ran down his spine. The man hadn't moved an inch, hadn't raised his voice, but the sudden, absolute stillness in his eyes, the almost palpable sense of dormant power, was unnerving. It was like looking into the eyes of a deep ocean, calm on the surface, but hinting at unfathomable depths and unseen dangers below. The bluster began to drain from Gavin's face, replaced by a momentary, involuntary doubt. He had expected a reaction, an outburst, a flinch. Now he had not expected this absolute, unwavering calm, this profound and unyielding presence. The silence that descended upon the immediate vicinity of the checkout line was thick, heavy, broken only by the distant beeping of other registers and the hurried whispers of onlookers. The cashier, her hands still frozen, stared, captivated by the silent confrontation. Mark continued to hold Gavin's gaze, not blinking, his head tilted ever so slightly. A micro-expression that spoke of analysis, of assessment, of a quiet, lethal calculation. "You have two options," Mark finally said, his voice dropping even lower. Barely a whisper, yet it cut through the tension with the precision of a scalpel. "You can step back, apologize, and leave. Or," he paused, his eyes flicking down to Lily for a fraction of a second before returning to Gavin. You can continue. But understand this. If you continue, the consequences will be entirely your own, and they will be far more significant than you can possibly imagine." His words weren't a threat, not in the vulgar sense Gavin was accustomed to. They were a statement of fact, a stark delineation of boundaries, delivered with the quiet authority of someone who had long passed the need for bluster. It was the voice of a man who had seen the absolute worst of humanity and understood intimately the precise mechanics of violence and its inevitable repercussions. Gavin's bravado, which had been so potent against the timid and the unprepared, seemed to shrivel in the face of this unwavering, almost preternatural calm. He found himself, for the first time in this confrontation, at a loss for words, his mouth agape. His bluster caught in his throat. The mask of arrogant superiority slipped, revealing a flicker of genuine apprehension. He had poked a bear, but this bear was not roaring. It was simply watching, waiting, its silence far more terrifying than any growl. The store, for a brief electric moment, held its breath. The air in the checkout line, already thick with the drone of consumerism and the low hum of impatient whispers, suddenly went utterly still. Marcus, emboldened by the silent, seemingly complacent father and the crowd's apparent indifference, had overstepped a boundary that most people, even the most aggressive, instinctively understood. His hand, heavy and uninvited, reached out, not for David, but for Lily, whose small frame had been pressed protectively against her father's leg. It wasn't a grab, not yet, but a menacing gesture, a possessive, predatory finger extending towards her hair, accompanied by a sneer that promised imminent violation. "And what's this little brat gonna do, huh? Cry to her daddy?" In that infinitesimal fraction of a second, the world tilted. The weary resignation that had settled like a shroud over David's shoulders evaporated, replaced by an intensity so profound, so utterly devoid of warmth, that it seemed to drain all light from the immediate vicinity. His eyes, moments before a placid, tired blue, hardened into chips of glacial ice, reflecting not the fluorescent supermarket lights, but something ancient and dangerous. It wasn't anger that flared, not in the conventional sense of a furious outburst, but rather a chilling, surgical precision. The transformation was breathtakingly swift, a complete metamorphosis from a man barely holding onto a single thread of patience to a predator perfectly poised. Every muscle in David's body, previously relaxed into the slouch of an overworked parent, tightened with a coiled energy that rippled beneath his modest clothing. His shoulders squared, his chin subtly lowered, and his stance, almost imperceptibly, shifted, grounding him like an immovable force. Marcus, still smirking, his hand a mere inch from Lily, saw the change, but understood none of it. He registered the sudden stillness, the way David's head subtly cocked, but his arrogance blinded him to the primal warning. Before he could even register a tremor of unease, before the smirk could fully contort into a question, David moved. It wasn't a lunge nor a wild swing. It was a fluid, almost balletic motion, and born of countless hours of brutal training, honed in the crucible of absolute necessity. His left hand, a blur of motion, shot out not to strike, but to intercept. It caught Marcus's wrist with the unyielding grip of a steel vise, halting the bully's offensive gesture midair. The force of the grab was enough to make Marcus gasp, the sudden, unexpected pressure on his radial bone sending a shockwave of pain up his arm. Simultaneously, David's right hand, a flash of controlled power, came up and inwards, striking Marcus not with a fist, but with the hardened edge of his palm, a precise, calculated blow just beneath the earlobe, targeting a specific pressure point. The impact was not loud but devastatingly effective. It was not a knockout punch, but a debilitating stun. Marcus's eyes widened, not just from the pain, but from the sudden disorienting shock. His knees buckled, his carefully constructed bravado shattering like fragile glass. He let out a choked sound, a mixture of surprise and genuine fear, his body momentarily paralyzed, deprived of equilibrium and the will to resist. The crowd, which had been frozen in a tableau of horrified anticipation, collectively gasped, a wave of sound that rippled through the previously silent store. No one had anticipated such a swift, devastating counter. It was too fast, too efficient, too professional. But David wasn't done. This wasn't about rage. It was about establishing absolute control, about demonstrating an unambiguous boundary. As Marcus slumped, David's grip on his wrist never slackened. He twisted, not violently, but with a precise application of leverage, and bringing Marcus's arm behind his back in a painful, restricting hold. The bully, now a whimpering mess, found himself bent at an awkward, agonizing angle, completely at David's mercy. His face, moments ago contorted in a sneer, was now pale, sweat beading on his forehead, his breath coming in ragged gasps. David leaned in, his voice a low, guttural murmur that barely carried beyond Marcus's ear, yet resonated with an unmistakable, lethal authority. "You touch my daughter again, and I will show you what true pain feels like. Not the kind you inflict on others, but the kind that makes you wish you were never born." The words were not a threat, but a promise, delivered with a chilling conviction that stripped away any remaining pretense of civility. Marcus felt the cold, hard reality of the situation sink in. This wasn't just a man defending his child. This was something else entirely. The eyes that stared into his were devoid of emotion, the gaze of someone who had seen and done things that no ordinary civilian could comprehend. A man, portly and middle-aged, who had been watching from the produce aisle, his face slowly transforming from detached curiosity to utter shock, suddenly took a shaky step forward. His hand instinctively went to his chest, then he squinted, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Oh my God," he whispered, the words barely audible. That's Sergeant Major Miller." The name hung in the air, a bell tolling a forgotten truth. Another man, older, with a military bearing and a faded U.S. Army veteran's hat, gasped. "Miller? The Miller? The ghost of Kandahar?" His voice, laced with awe and a touch of reverence, it cut through the residual tension like a knife. The murmurs intensified, shifting from shock to recognition. Whispers of Delta Force, Special Ops, and Legendary began to spread like wildfire through the checkout line. Lily, who had cowered behind her father, now peered out, her small hand instinctively reaching for David's free hand. Her father, who had always been her gentle giant, her protector, had just become something akin to a superhero in her eyes. The initial fear was quickly replaced by a profound sense of security and unwavering trust. She saw the powerful, silent control her dad wielded, and in that moment understood the quiet strength she had always felt emanating from him. David, still maintaining his iron grip on Marcus, scanned the crowd with those same chillingly calm eyes. He recognized the shift in perception, the dawning realization on faces that had minutes ago dismissed him as a weary single father. He felt the weight of his past, a past he had painstakingly tried to bury, resurfacing with an undeniable force. His true identity, the formidable soldier he had once been, was now irrevocably exposed in this mundane public arena. With a final, decisive movement, David released Marcus, but not before subtly guiding him forward with a precisely aimed push that sent the bully stumbling towards the approaching security guard and the sound of distant sirens. Marcus, disoriented and humiliated, barely managed to stay on his feet. His bravado utterly evaporated, replaced by a raw, primal fear. He didn't even dare look back at David. He just wanted to escape. Two police officers, already en route for a minor shoplifting incident, that arrived just as Marcus was being apprehended by the store's bewildered security staff. They took one look at the distraught bully, the awed crowd, And then their eyes landed on David. One of the officers, a seasoned veteran named Officer Davies, recognized the posture, the quiet intensity. He had served in the military himself and knew the look of a man who had seen too much, done too much. He even thought he recognized David's face from an old, grainy commendation photo in a regimental museum, a photo of a hero. "Sir," Officer Davies said, his voice respectful, even deferential, "is everything all right here?" David, his gaze now softer but still with that underlying steel, simply nodded. He knelt down, bringing himself to Lily's level, stroking her hair. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Daddy handled it." Lily hugged him tightly, burying her face in his chest. "You're the strongest, Daddy," she whispered, her voice muffled but filled with unwavering love. Officer Davies, observing the tender interaction, understood. He had witnessed countless altercations. But this was different. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was a measured, precise response from a professional. He knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that David had exercised immense restraint. Marcus was undoubtedly humiliated and sore, but not seriously injured. Had David truly unleashed his capabilities, the outcome would have been far more severe. "We'll take care of him, sir," Officer Davies assured David, gesturing towards Marcus, who was now being handcuffed, still looking utterly terrified. "Sounds like he got more than he bargained for." The other officer nodded in agreement, a silent understanding passing between the former military men. The checkout line, which had dissolved into chaos, slowly began to reform. But the atmosphere was irrevocably altered. No longer was David just another face in the crowd. He was Sergeant Major Miller, the legendary Delta Force operator, the man who had faced down terrorists in forgotten deserts, who had risked his life for causes far greater than a supermarket queue. People avoided his gaze out of a mixture of respect and fear, a few offering hesitant, apologetic smiles. Some even offered to let him go ahead in line, an unspoken acknowledgement of the ordeal he'd endured. David, however, declined with a quiet shake of his head. He just wanted to pay for his groceries and take Lily home. The spotlight was not where he belonged, not anymore. Known his battles were meant to be fought in the shadows, not in the brightly lit aisles of a grocery store. He paid for his items, the cashier, a young woman who had witnessed the entire scene with wide, trembling eyes, fumbling slightly with the change. She avoided eye contact, offering a respectful, "Thank you, sir," that held a new weight. As he walked out holding Lily's hand, the whispers followed him. The ghost of Kandahar had made an unexpected appearance, not in a dusty foreign land, but in the most mundane of American settings, defending his most precious treasure. He had revealed a fraction of his true self, not out of choice but out of necessity, a stark reminder that heroes often walk among us in the most unassuming disguises. Their pasts a heavy burden, their skills a last resort. David adjusted Lily's backpack on his shoulder, the weight of it familiar and comforting, a stark contrast to the weight of the rifle he once carried. He was no longer Sergeant Major Miller in the full active sense. He was David, a single father trying his best, struggling with the everyday realities of life, his extraordinary past a silent, ever-present shadow. He wished for nothing more than to live a quiet life, to raise his daughter, to give her the normalcy he'd never truly known. But the incident in the supermarket served as a chilling reminder. Some shadows, no matter how deeply buried, always find a way to resurface when those he loved are threatened. He just wanted to get home, to cook dinner, to help Lily with her homework, to watch a movie, to be a dad. That was his mission now, and it was, in its own way, as vital and challenging as any he had ever faced. The quiet strength he possessed, the formidable skills he tried to keep hidden, were not for glory or recognition. They were for moments like these, for the absolute unyielding protection of the small, innocent hand he now held firmly in his own. His legend was not in the medals or the commendations, but in the unwavering love and fierce devotion he held for his daughter. And in that, he found his true, enduring purpose. Have you ever witnessed a moment where someone's true character or hidden strength was unexpectedly revealed? Share your story in the comments below.